My name is Eleonora Conti. For 40 years, I was a quiet, unassuming bookkeeper for a small Florentine leather goods company. My daughter, Alessia, saw me as a simple woman, a relic from a bygone era of frugality and modest living. She believed I was poor, a sweet, slightly dotty old woman sitting on a single valuable asset, my villa. So she and her husband sold it out from under me. They moved me into a small, sad apartment and took the proceeds to fund their lavish, important lives. What they did not know is that my simplicity was a choice, and my poverty was a carefully constructed fiction. I let them do it. I let them sell my home, I let them take the money, and eventually lose everything. I let them fall all the way to the bottom, to a life of humiliating, back-breaking work, before I finally decided it was time to reveal the secret I had been keeping for decades, the truth of my €5 million fortune. This is not a story of a woman who was betrayed. This is the story of a mother who had to design the most painful, elaborate, and heartbreaking test in the world to find out who her child had truly become. Before the test began, my life was one of quiet, contented, and deeply private abundance. My home, a beautiful, sun-drenched villa in the hills of Tuscany overlooking Florence, was my sanctuary. It was the house my late husband, Roberto, and I had filled with a lifetime of love, laughter, and, most importantly, books. Roberto had been a brilliant and unassuming professor of economics who had viewed the world of finance not as a casino, but as a complex, fascinating intellectual puzzle. And he had been a master at solving it. Over 40 years, he had quietly, methodically turned his modest professor's salary into a substantial fortune. It was our secret, a private game we played together, a testament to his belief in patience, research, and the power of compound interest. Our life was never about flash or status. We drove a sensible Fiat, took quiet, scholarly trips to Rome and Venice, and found our greatest joy in the simple, priceless luxury of a home filled with art, music, and the people we loved. After he passed away 10 years ago, I continued his work. I was not just a retired bookkeeper. I was the careful, silent custodian of our secret wealth. I lived a simple, frugal life because it was the life I had always known, the life I was comfortable with. I mended my own clothes, tended my own garden of lemon trees and roses, and found joy in a home-cooked meal of pasta, not an expensive restaurant. My neighbors saw me as the sweet, slightly eccentric widow, Signora Conti, pottering in her garden. No one saw the woman who would spend her evenings managing a multi-million-euro portfolio with the same quiet, methodical skill she used to balance a ledger. My daughter, Alessia, was a different creature entirely. She had been raised with our quiet values, but she had rejected them completely. She was captivated by the glittering, superficial world of status and appearance. She had married a man, Marco, who was a perfect reflection of her own ambitions. He was a handsome, charismatic entrepreneur who spoke in a constant stream of business jargon, synergy, disruption, leverage, but who never seemed to produce anything of actual value.
Their lives were a performance of wealth. They drove a leased luxury car they could not afford, wore designer clothes with the tags still faintly visible, and lived in a sleek, minimalist apartment in the center of Florence with a rent that was, I knew, a source of constant, simmering panic. They were not building a life, they were building a brand, and they were deeply, desperately in debt. Their visits to my quiet, comfortable villa were a study in polite, barely concealed condescension. They would look at my worn, beloved furniture with pitying eyes. They would taste my simple, home-cooked food and talk about the trendy new aperitivo bar they had just been to. They saw my life not as a choice, but as a limitation. They saw a poor, out-of-touch old woman who simply did not understand how the world worked anymore. And they saw my villa, my beautiful, debt-free, and increasingly valuable villa, as a tragic waste of capital. The campaign began a year ago. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a slow, methodical assault disguised as loving concern. It started with my loneliness. "Mama," Alicia would say, her face a perfect mask of filial devotion, "we are just so worried about you all alone in this huge house. What if you fell? Who would know?" Then it was my health. "You seem a bit more forgetful lately," Marco would say, his tone of deep, brotherly worry. "Are you sure you are eating properly? Managing all this on your own must be a terrible strain." They were not just expressing concern, they were building a narrative. They were creating a character for me. The frail, slightly senile old woman who simply did not understand how the world worked anymore. And they saw my villa, my beautiful, debt-free, and increasingly valuable villa, as a tragic waste of capital. The campaign began a year ago. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a slow, methodical assault disguised as loving concern. It started with my loneliness. "Mama," Alicia would say, her face a perfect mask of filial devotion, "we are just so worried about you, all alone in this huge house. What if you fell? Who would know?" Then it was my health. "You seem a bit more forgetful lately," Marco would say, his tone of deep, brotherly worry. "Are you sure you are eating properly? Managing all this on your own must be a terrible strain." They were not just expressing concern, they were building a narrative. They were creating a character for me. The frail, slightly senile old woman who simply did not understand how the world worked anymore. And they saw my villa, my beautiful, debt-free, and increasingly valuable villa, as a tragic waste of capital. With the foundation of my supposed incompetence laid, they made their real move. They came to me one Sunday afternoon, their faces composed in a portrait of solemn, familial duty. "Mama," Alicia began, her voice thick with a rehearsed emotion, "we have been talking, and we think we have found the perfect solution for all of us. We are going to move in with you. We can take care of you, manage the house, ensure you are safe and sound. We are a family. We need to be together." I knew exactly what they were doing. But in that moment, as I looked at my daughter's beautiful, earnest, and utterly false face,
my awakening was not
different,
a sudden,
more terrible,
shocking discovery
and
of their
more compelling
betrayal.
idea began to
I
form
had
in my
seen
own
the
mind.
subtle signs of their greed for years. My awakening was the birth of a plan, a terrible, heartbreaking, and, I felt, necessary experiment. My husband had left me with a great fortune, but he had also left me with a question that had haunted me for a decade. Had we raised a daughter who valued money more than she valued her own mother? I had a choice. I could confront them. I could reveal my wealth, call out their lies, and banish them from my life, or I could find out the truth, once and for all. I could discover the absolute, unvarnished truth of my daughter's character. I decided to give her the ultimate test. I would give her a choice between a poor mother and a rich house, and I would let her choose. "That is a wonderful idea, my dears," I said, my voice a convincing imitation of a relieved, grateful old woman. "I would be so happy to have you here." In that moment, I was no longer just a mother. I was a scientist, and my own family had become my laboratory. The hypothesis was simple. Was my daughter's love conditional? I was about to conduct the experiment to find out. With my permission secured, they moved in, and the second phase of their campaign began immediately. It was a relentless, grinding assault on my financial fragility. Mama, we have been looking at your bills, the property taxes, the upkeep on this place. It is a ticking bomb. You are house poor. One major repair, and you would be in serious trouble. Alessia would then apply the emotional pressure. We lie awake at night worrying about it. We are only doing this because we love you, Mama. We want you to be secure. The only responsible thing to do is to sell the villa. We can take the money, invest it for you, and move you into a lovely, manageable little apartment. You would not have to worry about a thing. I played my part to perfection. I was confused. I was resistant. I was a sentimental old woman clinging to her memories. I made them fight for it. I made them reveal the full, ugly depths of their greed and their manipulative skill. I made them use every weapon in their arsenal, from the language of love to the threat of my own impending destitution.
I let them bring in their own financial advisor, a slick, predatory friend of Marco's, who looked at my modest pension statements and declared my situation precarious. I let them bring in a real estate agent who walked through my beautiful, beloved home, her eyes seeing not a life, but a commission. Finally, after weeks of this relentless psychological siege, I gave them what they wanted. I broke. I sat at my kitchen table, tears streaming down my face, tears that were not entirely a performance, for the grief of what I was witnessing was very real, and I surrendered. "You are right," I whispered, my voice a broken, defeated thing. "I am just being a foolish old woman. It is for the best. I will sign the papers." The look of triumphant, barely concealed relief that passed between them was a physical blow. The next day, they presented me with the documents, a durable power of attorney, giving them complete control over my finances, and the listing agreement for the sale of my villa. I signed my life away. I watched as they took the papers, their faces a mask of solemn, loving victory. They believed they had just won. They had just secured their future. They had just solved all their problems. They had no idea they had just willingly, enthusiastically, and irrevocably disinherited themselves. The experiment was now fully underway. The sale of the villa happened with a speed that was both breathtaking and brutal. My feigned capitulation had unleashed a frenzy of activity in Alessia and Marco. They found a cash buyer within a week, a foreign investment group that was, I had no doubt, a shell company created by Marco, designed to acquire a valuable property at a deliberately undervalued price. They rushed the closing, citing my fragile emotional state and the need to simplify my life as quickly as possible. The moving day, October 5th, was a quiet, methodical execution of the life Herberto and I had built. I sat in a chair in the living room, a silent, ghost-like figure, and watched as strangers wrapped my memories in paper and placed them in boxes. Alessia and Marco were not sentimental. They were efficient. They directed the movers with the brisk, impersonal energy of a corporate liquidation team. There was no sadness, only a barely concealed, vibrating excitement. They had chosen a new home for me. It was a small, one-bedroom apartment in a sterile, modern apartment block on the outskirts of Florence. The walls were a pale, institutional beige, and the windows looked out over a busy highway. The contrast to my warm, book-filled, sun-drenched villa in the Tuscan hills was a deliberate and calculated cruelty. It was a visual representation of my new diminished status in their lives. As the last moving truck pulled away from my old home, Marco handed me a thin envelope. "Here is the first month's allowance, Mama," he said, his voice full of a false, magnanimous cheer. "We have put the rest of the proceeds from the sale of the villa into that high-yield investment fund we talked about. You're all set for life. Not a single thing to worry about." I took the envelope. It contained a few €100. I was a multimillionaire, and I had been placed on a pauper's allowance paid for with my own money. I played my part, my eyes filling with grateful, pathetic tears. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you both for taking care of everything."
They left me there, in the small, beige room, surrounded by a few of my old books and a single photograph of Roberto. They believed they had won. They believed the story was over. In truth, it had just begun. My new life was one of quiet, monastic simplicity. Theirs was a volcanic eruption of hedonism. In my lonely apartment, I had one link to the outside world, a simple tablet computer I had insisted on keeping. It was my window into their world, a world they were now documenting with a gleeful, shameless pride on social media. The high-yield investment fund was, it seemed, a new Ferrari for Marco. A sleek red machine he photographed from every angle, parked in front of the Duomo. It was a new wardrobe for Alessia. A succession of Gucci and Prada dresses she flaunted in endless selfies taken in the most expensive cafes in Florence. It was a 2-week first-class trip to the Amalfi Coast, a trip they documented with a kind of desperate, performative joy. Champagne on a private boat in Positano, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, helicopter tours of Capri. They were not just spending the money, they were burning it. A frantic, joyless bonfire of my life savings. They were two starving people who had been let loose in a banquet hall, and they were gorging themselves sick. There was no thought for the future, no concept of investment, no inkling of the responsibility they had claimed to be so concerned about. There was only the raw, ugly, and insatiable hunger of their own greed. They would call me once a week from a beautiful, sun-drenched location, their voices full of the strained, guilty cheerfulness of children who had abandoned their parent. They would ask if I was comfortable, if I needed anything, all while posting pictures of themselves on a yacht. They believed their own lies, that they had done me a favor, that their own happiness was the ultimate justification for their actions. This period of my experiment was the most painful. It was not the pain of a victim. It was the unique, agonizing pain of a mother watching her own child fail a fundamental moral test. Every photograph Alessia posted, every gleeful status update about her new, fabulous life, was a dagger in my heart. I had not just lost my house. I was losing my daughter, watching her transform, day by day, into a shallow, greedy stranger I no longer recognized. The doubt that crept in was not about the facts. I knew they were liars and thieves. The doubt was about my own plan. Was I being cruel? Was this test a form of entrapment? Had I, by giving them the rope, become responsible for the hanging? The mother in me, the woman who had spent a lifetime protecting her child from the consequences of her actions, was at war with the quiet, cold-eyed bookkeeper who knew that some lessons can only be learned through pain. It was during this time that I activated my own secret asset.
I made an appointment with Signore Rossi, the lawyer who had managed my husband's estate, a man of unimpeachable integrity and the only other person on earth who knew the truth of my financial situation. I met him in his quiet, book-lined office on the banks of the Arno. "The experiment is underway, Signore Rossi," I told him, "and the results, so far, are catastrophic." He listened as I detailed the sale of the villa and their subsequent spending spree. His face, a kind, scholarly mask, hardened into a look of grim resolve. "What do you want me to do, Eleonora?" "I want you to watch them. I want you to hire a private investigator. I do not want you to intervene. I just want you to document their fall. I need a record. I need to know exactly how deep the rot goes." Signore Rossi looked at me, a long, appraising look, and he saw not a frail old woman, but a woman of cold, hard purpose. He nodded slowly. "As you wish, Eleonora. The observation will begin immediately." The fall, when it came, was faster and more brutal than I could have ever imagined. The money from the villa sale, a sum that should have lasted a lifetime with prudent management, was a finite resource in the hands of two people with an infinite capacity for consumption. The investigators' reports, which Signore Rossi would forward to me in discreet, encrypted emails, were a grim, weekly chronicle of their implosion. Marco, the financial genius, had taken the last of the money and sunk it into a series of high-risk, speculative schemes he did not understand. Cryptocurrency, fraudulent art funds, a can't-miss real estate development in Sicily. The market turned, the schemes collapsed, and the money vanished, almost overnight. The creditors who had been held at bay by the sudden influx of cash began to circle again. The stories of their downfall were small, humiliating vignettes. A credit card declined at a fancy restaurant, an argument with the landlord over late rent on their new, even more expensive apartment in Oltrarno. The sleek red Ferrari was a leased vehicle, and the reports of its eventual repossession from the street in the dead of night brought me no joy, only a profound, aching sadness. And I watched it all, sitting in my own quiet home, surrounded by the ghosts of my life and the valuable items that townsfolk had brought back to me. I was in a position to save Marco and Eleonora from themselves. I could have intervened, bought them more time, but I knew it would be useless. They had built a beautiful, glittering cage of wealth around themselves, and they were now beginning to realize that the door had locked behind them. They had believed the money would last forever. They had believed their new life was permanent. They were about to learn that nothing is more temporary than a fool's paradise. The final report from the investigator arrived on a cold, gray morning, 6 months after the sale of my villa. It was a short, brutal summary of their complete and total ruin. Marco, faced with insurmountable debt from his failed schemes and the consequences of his own foolishness, had done what he always did. He had run. The investigator reported that he had cleared out their last remaining bank account and had boarded a one-way flight to South America, leaving a short, unapologetic note for his wife. He had abandoned her, just as they had abandoned me. Alessia was left with nothing. Less than nothing. She was saddled with the debts, the eviction notices, the wreckage of the life they had so carelessly built. The designer clothes were sold for pennies on the euro. The expensive furniture was repossessed. She was evicted from their luxury apartment, her belongings piled on the curb like common trash. The last page of the report contained a single, grainy photograph that will be seared into my memory for the rest of my life. It was of my daughter, Alessia, the girl who had dreamed of a life of glamour and ease. She was wearing a drab, gray uniform, her beautiful hair pulled back in a severe functional bun. She was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket across the stone floors of the Mercato Centrale after closing. She had found a job. She was working as a night shift janitor. I sat in my small, quiet apartment, the final report from the private investigator glowing on the screen of my tablet. The photograph of my daughter, Alessia, in her drab janitor uniform, was a final, brutal piece of data. The experiment was over. My hypothesis had been proven correct, with a certainty that brought me no satisfaction, only a profound, bottomless, and aching sorrow of a mother who had just received the final, terrible results of a test she had never wanted her child to fail. I sat in the quiet of my small, sterile apartment, the final report from the private investigator glowing on the screen of my tablet, the photograph of my daughter, Alessia, in her drab janitor uniform, was a final, brutal piece of data. The experiment was over. My hypothesis had been proven correct with a certainty that brought me no satisfaction, only a profound, bottomless, and aching sorrow of a mother who had just received the final, terrible results of a test she had never wanted her child to fail.
My daughter, given a choice between a poor mother and a rich house, had chosen the house. She had taken the money, a symbol of a life's worth of love and security, and she had burned it on the altar of her own vanity. Her husband, her partner in this betrayal, had abandoned her. She had lost everything. She had hit the bottom she had so desperately been trying to outrun her entire adult life. My first, most powerful instinct, the mother's instinct, was to run to her, to rescue her, to scoop her up from the wreckage of her life, to bring her back to a place of safety and comfort, to tell her it would all be all right. It was an instinct I had honored my entire life, an unconditional love that had led me to enable her, to soften the blows of her own poor choices, and, ultimately, to this very moment. But the bookkeeper in me, the quiet, analytical woman who had spent a lifetime understanding that ledgers must be balanced and accounts must be settled, knew that to rescue her now would be to tear out the final, most important pages of her story. It would be to rob her of the one, terrible, and potentially transformative lesson this entire painful exercise had been designed to teach. My resistance in this new phase of the war was not against her, but against myself. It was a battle against my own heart. I had to resist the urge to save her. I had to let her stay in that place of ruin. I had to let her truly, and for the first time in her life, feel the full, crushing weight of her own choices. I had to let the lesson sink in. Justice, in this case, was not a swift public affair of courts and prisons. It was a slow, quiet, and private reckoning, and it was not over yet. For 3 months, I did nothing. I lived my quiet life in my small apartment, and I waited. The reports from the investigator, which I had instructed Signore Rossi to continue, were a grim chronicle of Alessia's new life. The long hours, the physical exhaustion, the humiliation of her fall from a life of performative luxury to one of genuine, grinding poverty. It was a painful, necessary period of suffering. Finally, I decided it was time. She had experienced the consequences of her choices. Now she had to confront the truth of her own character. I called my lawyer, Signore Rossi. "Howard," I said, my voice calm and clear, "it is time to schedule the meeting." The letter that arrived at Alessia's small, run-down apartment was not a warm note from her mother. It was a cold, formal summons on the intimidating letterhead of Signore Rossi's prestigious law firm. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity and veiled threat.
It stated that his client, Eleonora Conti, was exploring her legal options regarding the recent fraudulent sale of her property and the subsequent misappropriation of the proceeds. It strongly advised her presence at a meeting in his office on the following Friday to discuss a potential pre-litigation resolution. To a woman who was broke, alone, and already at the bottom, this letter was not just a threat of a lawsuit, it was a threat of total annihilation. It was the final turn of the screw, a summons to her own judgment day. The week leading up to the meeting was, I can only imagine, a special kind of hell for Alessia. The investigators' reports described her as frantic, terrified. She tried to call me, but I had instructed Signore Rossi to have my number changed. She left a series of rambling, panicked voicemails for him, which he ignored. She had no money for a lawyer. She had no resources. She had no one to turn to. For the first time in her life, she was completely and utterly alone with the consequences of her own actions. While she was living her week of terror, I was preparing. I was not preparing for a legal battle. I was preparing for the final, most important lesson of my daughter's life. I went to my secret bank, a quiet, private institution that had managed my husband's fortune for decades. I had them prepare a full, current, and certified statement of my accounts, the final, shocking piece of evidence in my long experiment. I also met with Signore Rossi to draft my new, ironclad last will and testament. It was a simple, brutal, and, I felt, just document. It would be the final, closing argument in the case of my daughter's character. On the day of the meeting, I arrived at Signore Rossi's office an hour early. I was not dressed as the simple, frugal bookkeeper my daughter knew. I was dressed in a simple, but exquisitely tailored designer suit I had owned for years. My hair was perfectly coiffed. I was wearing my late husband's favorite pearls. I was not playing the part of the victim. I was the very picture of quiet, formidable, old money power. I sat in the grand book-lined conference room overlooking the Arno, and I waited. Alessia arrived exactly on time. When the receptionist showed her in, the sight of her took my breath away. She was thin, gaunt, her expensive clothes replaced by a cheap, worn-out sweater and jeans. Her beautiful, confident face was pale and etched with fear and exhaustion. Her hands, which had always been so perfectly manicured, were rough and red from the harsh chemicals of her new job. She looked broken.
She saw me, and her eyes widened in shock. She had expected to face a team of lawyers. She had not expected to face me, and certainly not a version of me that looked so powerful. She stood frozen in the doorway, a lost, terrified child. "Hello, Alessia," I said, my voice calm and even. "Please sit down." She stumbled into a chair opposite me at the vast, polished table. Signora Rossi sat at the head of the table, a silent, judicial presence. I got your lawyer's letter," she stammered. "Mamma, I can explain. It was all Marco. He tricked me. He lost all the money." "I am not interested in your excuses, Alessia," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic, practiced lies. "The time for lies is over. Today is the day for truth." I let her sit in a long, agonizing silence. She fidgeted, her eyes darting around the intimidating room, a cornered animal in a cage of her own making. Finally, I spoke. I did not begin with accusations. I did not begin with threats. I began with a simple, quiet question, the central question of my entire painful experiment. "Alessia," I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a final judgment, "I have just one question for you, and your answer to this question will determine the entire course of the rest of your life. So I advise you to think very, very carefully before you speak." She looked at me, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, her eyes wide with a desperate pleading hope. I leaned forward, my gaze steady and unwavering, the gaze of a mother, a judge, and a woman who had been pushed to the very edge and had found a core of steel she never knew she possessed. "Tell me, Alessia," I asked, "do you love me?" The question hung in the silent, book-lined room, a final, terrible, and beautifully simple test. Her entire future rested on the answer, and I, her mother, the woman she had betrayed and discarded, sat back and waited for the verdict. The conference room was a silent, paneled courtroom, and I was the judge, the jury, and the prosecution all in one. My daughter Alessia sat opposite me, a terrified defendant awaiting her sentence. The question I had asked her, the final, simple question of my long and painful experiment, hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute.
"Do you love me?" Her face, so thin and pale, crumbled. The bravado, the practiced charm, the years of entitled confidence, all of it dissolved in an instant, leaving only the raw, terrified core of the person she had become. A torrent of dry, silent sobs shook her body. She did not speak for a long time. My lawyer, Signore Rossi, and I waited, the silence in the room broken only by her ragged, desperate breaths. "I do not know," she finally whispered, the words a raw, honest sound of pure devastation. It was the first truly honest thing I had heard her say for years. "I thought I did. I told myself I did. But no. The person who did what I did, she did not love you. She loved the money. She loved the idea of the money more than anything. I am so sorry, Mama. I am so sorry." The confession, when it came, was not a justification. It was a verdict delivered upon herself. And in that moment of brutal, heartbreaking honesty, I felt not triumph, but a profound, aching sorrow. The results of my experiment were in, and my daughter had failed. Alessia's confession hung in the air, a raw, open wound. Before I could speak, Signore Rossi cleared his throat, his presence a sudden, cold intrusion of legal reality. He said, "Your apology is noted, Alessia. However, it does not change the facts of the case. Perhaps a brief summary is in order." For the next 20 minutes, he laid out the full, ugly scope of their betrayal, not as a family drama, but as a series of prosecutable offenses. He presented the private investigators' reports, documenting their systematic campaign of emotional manipulation and gaslighting. He showed her the fraudulent appraisal on the villa, a document that proved their intent to defraud me from the very beginning. He detailed the rapid, almost immediate liquidation of the proceeds from the sale, presenting a grim, itemized list of their expenditures. The leased Ferrari, the first-class flights to Paris, the Gucci and Prada shopping sprees. He showed her photographs. A picture of her and Marco laughing on a private boat in Posicano, dated just 2 weeks after they had moved me into the small, beige apartment. A picture of the Ferrari being repossessed in the dead of night. A picture of the eviction notice taped to the door of their luxury apartment. The legal term for what you and your husband did, Alessia, is felony financial elder abuse, combined with conspiracy to commit fraud. Given the evidence we have collected, a conviction would be a near certainty. A conservative sentence would be 5 to 7 years in a state prison. Marco, having fled the country, would be considered a fugitive from justice. Alessia stared at the photographs, at the evidence of her own shallow, greedy, and ultimately stupid choices. The reality of her situation, not just the moral reality, but the cold, hard legal reality, was crashing down upon her. She had not just lost the money, she was about to lose her freedom. She looked at me, her face a mask of pure, abject terror, a prisoner pleading with her judge for mercy. Just as the full weight of her legal peril was about to crush her, I held up a hand. I said, "That is enough, Signore Rossi." I looked at my daughter, my broken, terrified, and finally honest daughter. I said, "There is one more fact to be entered into the record. Alessia, I have to confess something. In all of this, I have not been entirely honest with you." I reached into my own briefcase and retrieved a single, heavy, cream-colored document. I slid it across the polished table toward her. It was a certified, notarized financial statement from a private bank in Zurich. I said, "You and Marco built your entire plan on a single, fundamental assumption. You believed that I was poor. You believed that the villa was the full extent of my wealth. You were wrong." Her eyes, confused and tear-filled, dropped to the page in front of her. I watched her as she read the first line, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched as her eyes moved to the final bottom-line number, and then I watched as her face registered a series of profound, convulsive emotions. First, a complete, uncomprehending shock. Then, a dawning, horrified disbelief. And finally, a sickening, soul-crushing understanding. She was not just looking at a number. She was looking at the full, staggering scope of her own miscalculation. She was looking at the 5,247,000 euros she had thrown away. "Your father was a quiet and brilliant investor," I explained, my voice devoid of all triumph, filled only with a great, weary sadness. He saw money not as something to be spent, but as a tool for creating security, for creating freedom. A secret we kept our entire lives. A secret I continued to honor after he was gone. She looked up from the page, her face ashen. The money she had stolen, the amount that had seemed like a king's ransom, was less than a tenth of my actual worth. The villa she had sold, the legacy she had sacrificed her own mother for, had been a rounding error. "This was never about the money, Alessia," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Not for me. It was about you. It was a test, a terrible, painful, and apparently necessary test. I needed to know the truth. I needed to know if the daughter I had raised would choose her mother, a woman she believed had nothing, or the promise of money. You made your choice. You showed me the truth of your own character, and for that, in a strange and painful way, I thank you." She began to sob, a deep, ragged sound of a soul that had finally and completely hit the bottom. "So what now? Are you sending me to prison?" "No. We will not be pressing charges. Prison would be too easy a punishment. Your punishment, Alessia, is this." I tapped the financial statement. "Your punishment is the knowledge of what you have thrown away. The knowledge that your greed, your impatience, and your profound lack of character cost you not just a fortune, but a family. You will have to live with that knowledge, with this truth, every single day for the rest of your life. That is your sentence." Signor Rossi then slid one final document across the table to her. "This," he said, "is your mother's new and final last will and testament." Her eyes scanned a page. It was a short, simple, and brutal document. It disinherited her and her fugitive husband Marco completely and irrevocably. The entirety of the 5 million euro Conti fortune was to be placed upon my death into a charitable foundation in my late husband's name, dedicated to promoting financial literacy and education in Italy. A separate, small, and tightly controlled trust would be established for any future grandchildren, a trust that she would never be able to touch or control. She stared at the papers, her face a mask of utter devastation. She had not just lost a future inheritance, she had been confronted with the full, ugly, and pathetic truth of her own choices. She had traded her mother's love and a life of unimaginable security for a few months of cheap, flashy, and ultimately worthless thrills. She had been appraised, and she had been found wanting. I stood up. "The meeting is over, Alessia," I said. "You are free to go." I walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving her alone with the two documents that were the final, damning record of her own self-destruction. The silence in the conference room after Alessia left was a heavy, profound thing. The unsigned will and the damning financial statement lay on the polished table, the final, stark exhibits in a trial that had just concluded. My lawyer, Signore Rossi, looked at me, his usual professional composure softened by a deep human sympathy. "Are you all right, Eleonora?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, the single word holding the weight of a year of pain. "But I will be." There was no triumph in what I had done, no thrill of victory. I had not unmasked a monster in a dramatic sting operation. I had simply held up a mirror to my own child and forced her to see the ugly truth of her own reflection. It was a necessary act, a just act, but it felt like a profound and terrible failure of my own. I returned to my small, simple apartment, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a quiet, necessary chrysalis, a place of transformation. I had entered it as a woman feigning weakness, and I would leave it as a woman who had finally embraced her own strength. The final piece of the ugly story resolved itself without my intervention. The private investigator's final report arrived a month later. Marco, my fugitive son-in-law, was arrested in Brazil, not for his crimes against me, but for the fraudulent schemes he had attempted to run with the last of my villa money. His greed had not ended with me. It had been a pattern, and it had finally, inevitably, caught up with him. He was extradited and would face his own separate justice, a footnote in my own much more painful story.
My daughter's sentence was not to be served in a prison of bars and steel, but in a far more difficult prison of her own making, a life of true and honest consequence. I did not contact her. I did not offer her a lifeline. My love for her in this new, terrible phase had to be a tough love, a love that understood that to rescue her now would be to rob her of the only lesson that could ever possibly save her. I continued to receive the investigators' discreet reports, not out of a desire to gloat, but out of a mother's painful, lingering need to know that her child was, at the very least, alive. The reports were a grim, monotonous chronicle of her struggle. She continued her work as a janitor. She lived in a run-down, barely habitable room in a rough neighborhood. She was alone. For the first time in her life, there was no one to bail her out, no one to soften the landing, no one to lie for her. After 6 months of this silent, painful observation, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Signore Rosi's office, the only way she knew to reach me. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting shaky. "Mama," it began, "I am not writing to ask for anything. I know I have no right. I am writing to say that I have thought about that day in the office every single day for the past 6 months. And I have thought about your question. Do you love me? The answer is yes. I just did not know what it meant. I loved you like a child loves a safety net, something that would always be there to catch me. I did not love you as a person. I did not respect you. I did not even see you. I only saw what you could do for me. That is not love. It is a form of theft. I am so sorry for the person I was. I am trying every day to become someone different. I do not expect you to ever see me or speak to me again. I just needed you to know that I finally understand." It was the first small and fragile seed of a genuine atonement. While Alessia was beginning her long journey of rebuilding her character, I began the joyful work of rebuilding my life. My first act was to leave the small beige apartment behind. I did not buy back my old villa. Its memories were too complicated, its story too full. Instead, I bought a magnificent penthouse apartment in the heart of Florence, a place of glass and light and breathtaking views of the Duomo. It was a home that was unapologetically mine, a space that reflected not the quiet, frugal bookkeeper the world had known, but the wealthy, intelligent, and independent woman I truly was. My second act was to give my wealth a purpose beyond my own comfort. I formally established the foundation my new will had outlined, the Roberto Conti Foundation for Financial Literacy. Its mission was a simple one: to teach young people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, the principles of saving, investing, and the quiet, powerful art of building a life of true and not performative security. My husband's secret game became his public legacy. I was no longer a quiet background figure. I became an active philanthropist, a respected member of the city's charitable community. I traveled. I collected art. I filled my beautiful new home with music and conversation and friends. I was not just living, I was thriving. I had spent a lifetime curating the accounts of others. Now, for the first time, I was the sole author of my own.
Years passed. Alessia continued her slow, quiet, and solitary journey. She got a new, more respectable job as an administrative assistant. She went to night school, earning a degree in social work. She lived a simple, humble, and honest life. She would send me a short, simple letter on my birthday and on holidays, never asking for anything, just sharing a small piece of her new, quiet life. When she finally earned her degree, after 5 long years of work and study, I decided it was time. I invited her to meet me for tea. The woman who met me at a small, elegant cafe in a quiet piazza was a stranger. The hard, glittering ambition was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, weary, and profound humility. She was no longer a beautiful, dazzling girl. She was a woman, her face and hands showing the wear of a hard-lived life. Our conversation was tentative, careful. We did not speak of the past. We spoke of her work, of her plans for the future. She wanted to work with underprivileged families. She wanted to help people. For the first time, her life was about something other than herself. As we were about to leave, I placed an envelope on the table. "This is not from me," I said. "It is from the Roberto Conti Foundation. They have a program that provides grants to promising new social workers to help them set up their first practice. You should apply." Tears filled her eyes. It was not a handout. It was an opportunity. It was not forgiveness, but it was a form of respect. It was a bridge. Today is October 5th. It is the anniversary of the day the movers came, the day I was officially cast out of my home, the day my quiet, painful observation began. I'm sitting on the terrace of my penthouse apartment, a cup of coffee in my hand, looking out over the tiled rooftops of Florence as the morning sun washes them in gold. My morning ritual is a quiet, contemplative one. I am grinding beans for a special single-origin coffee. It is a rare and complex varietal I have had sourced from the rich, volcanic soil of the Vietnamese Central Highlands. Its flavor is bold, honest, and without artifice. It reminds me of what is real. My relationship with Alessia is a quiet, careful work in progress. We see each other occasionally. The great, gaping wound between us has closed, but it has left a deep and permanent scar. The old, easy, unconditional love is gone forever. In its place is something more difficult, more honest, and perhaps, in the end, more valuable. A conditional respect earned through the hard, painful work of atonement and change. I often think about my life as a bookkeeper. My job was to ensure that the ledgers were always balanced, that every debit had a credit. For years, I had allowed the ledger of my love for my daughter to be profoundly, dangerously unbalanced. My painful test was my way of finally, brutally, demanding an accounting.
I have learned that true love is not about giving endlessly without a return. It is a balanced ledger. It requires mutual respect, honest credits of gratitude, and the earned trust that the other party will not drain the account and leave you bankrupt. It is a lesson I learned at a terrible, unimaginable price, but it is a lesson that has finally and truly set me free.